Well, last night we had Refuel Under the 10 and we started a new series called This Should Be on Netflix. This is not just a you come sit listen to the lesson kind of a series. This is a we need you to be involved kind of a series. So what we're asking you to do is to take the card that you received last night to answer some questions on the life of David, and to send that card you can either send a picture of that card back in to the number that's on the card, or you can just text your answers in. But we're going to put together a pitch for Netflix that the life of David needs to be made into a show. So I want to know what the title should be, what actors and actresses you would cast, and also what rating it should be. A lot of you are saying it should be rated mature, so we'll see. So I'm going to play for you last night's lesson if you weren't able to be at youth group, and you can watch the lesson. If you lost your card or you weren't at youth group and you didn't get a card, you can follow the link to our Instagram bio right here, and you can download those cards just so you can see what the questions are and that you can participate too. And watch for tomorrow, Friday, we're going to upload our pitch to Netflix as a youth group together. So enjoy the lesson. Thank you for coming last night. If you can't come, just know that you can still be involved with what we're doing, and I hope to see your answers. I'm really excited to see what you have to say. We're starting a new series, a new lesson series, and we've never done one like this before. The name of the series is called This Should Be on Netflix. And one thing that we've had a really good relationship with lately during this pandemic is Netflix, right? We've spent a lot more time in front of us. Some of you are like, yeah, I can see the guilty look on your face. Spent a lot more time in front of a screen. And another issue we're having is that it's hard to stay motivated to read the Bible when you're inside all day. And some of you are like, hey, I'm just excited to be out here. So what we're going to be doing over the next 4 weeks is we're going to be going over 4 different stories in the Bible that I think should be a Netflix show, because there's this much interesting information. It's entertaining. Not that we just read the Bible for entertainment, but these stories are really entertaining. So everybody should have got a card as you came in. Did everybody get the card? If not, Matt's back there and he can get one for you. If you didn't get a card, just raise your hand and we'll get you one. Oh, Hudson needs a card over there. Logan needs a card. I think everybody else has a card. So what we're going to be doing is, this is kind of like a 2-part lesson. The first part of the lesson is I do it tonight. The second part of the lesson is you go home and you finish the lesson yourself. You teach yourself the rest of the lesson. So I'm going to explain to you how this is going to work over the next 4 weeks. I've got this, and tonight it's going to be the show of David. We think David should be a Netflix show. If you look at the back of your card here, what I'm going to ask you to do is read through these passages. You don't have to, but if you want to, read through these passages when you go home. And I want you to answer these questions and text them back to me. I've got the number down on the bottom. If David was to be a Netflix show, what should be the title of his show? How would you describe the plot of this show on David in a sentence? If you had to give the Netflix show about David's life a rating, what would it be? And finally, what actors or actresses should be cast for the big roles like David, Goliath, Saul, and Bathsheba? I think Liam Neeson should be David, by the way, but that's just me. So come up with those answers tomorrow, and by the end of the day tomorrow, text them, and then on Friday, I'm going to upload a video of me making a pitch to Netflix with the whole story and your suggestions for show title, actor, actress's title, rating, and description. So we've never done a lesson like this before because it's something we're all going to work together on. So I'm going to give you an overview of David's life tonight, really fast. And you can go by on your card here on the back, or on the front, I guess. I think it should be 3 seasons, 4 episodes a season. And I've come up with some names. April and a few other people vetoed a few of my names. They said they were inappropriate. I would never come up with anything inappropriate, would I? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the life of David, and then I'm going to give you a couple little observations about the life of David that we can apply to our life and that we should be looking at as we're reading these. So we start in season 1 of the life of David, and I called this Diary of a Wimpy Kid, because David is the youngest of 8 brothers. Nobody
expects David to amount to much, but there's a king in Israel, and his name was Saul, and he disobeyed God. He displeased God, and God tells Saul, Saul, your days are over. You're not going to be king of Israel anymore. Your days are numbered. Your time is limited. I'm going to raise up a new king. God sends his prophet Samuel to anoint David, this little, he's a shepherd boy. He's the youngest. He's the run of the litter, and we find David is at a young age, maybe early teen, maybe even a little younger. He is anointed to that one day he's going to be king of Israel. The next episode, I call it Listen to the Music, because Saul, it says that the Spirit of God left Saul, the king, and he became tormented by a demon. He became very anxious and very agitated, kind of like you in quarantine, very anxious, very agitated. So Saul said to his servants, will you send to my palace someone who can play the harp and the lyre? It's kind of like an old guitar type thing. And David was apparently a really good harp player, so they got David as a young kid or a young teen, or an older kid. And David would play the music, and it would soothe Saul's soul. So I think that would be a good episode 1. You see Saul get really into one of those dark, how sometimes shows have a dark episode? That would be the dark episode. And Saul goes through this really dark place. David comes in and through the music lightens his soul. The next episode in season 1 is episode 3, The Harder They Fall. That's the quintessential David story. That's where the nation of Israel goes off to battle. Nobody will face this giant Goliath. David doesn't even go to battle. He's still tending the sheep. And David shows up to bring his brothers some food. And he's like, why aren't you guys fighting? They're like, well, there's this big ogre guy, giant. And well, why doesn't somebody fight him? He's talking bad about God. And David says, if you guys won't fight him, I will. And they're like, David, you're like a preteen. You're still halfway through puberty. Like, come on, David. And David says, I'll do it. So they send him out to fight the giant. David doesn't bring a spear. He doesn't bring a sword. He brings a slingshot. The Bible says that as he slings that rock towards Goliath, it hits him right in the forehead where there's no armor, the only place where there's no armor. And it says the rock sinks into his skull. You'll be reading about that as you go through your reading. So obviously supernatural, right? Rocks don't just sink through people's skull. Then when Goliath falls, David takes Goliath's sword, chops his head off. The Philistines are defeated, and David walks back into the city holding the head of Goliath. That's a pretty awesome way to end an episode, right? So then the final episode of season 1, I called it a bromance for the ages. Like every bro needs a bromance, like a guy that he's just so close to. He's buddies with. And David found that in Jonathan. And we see this complex relationship develop in this final episode of season 1 because David and Jonathan are friends, but Jonathan's father is Saul, the king. And Saul's starting to get a little jealous of David, and that's where season 1 ends. And you have to, if it's a Netflix show, you got to wait 1.5 years for season 2, right? Hashtag Stranger Things. So then season 2 starts, and I put that one. I put the title for that. I Still Get Jealous for the first episode. In love for Nick Jonas. But Saul starts getting jealous of David because Saul's got this worked out. He sits in the palace. David goes out and wins all the wars for him. But then people start thinking that David is more important than Saul. And Saul's still king. So Saul starts getting jealous of David. And he wants to find a way to get rid of David. So then we go into episode number 2 of season 2. And this one gets a little dicey. I went through a couple different names for this episode, but I just called it A Cut Above the Rest. And Saul says to David, hey, David, you want to have you want to marry my daughter? Because that's how they did it back then. It was like, horse trading or something, apparently. You want to have my daughter's hand? Here's what you need to do. You need to go and kill 100 Philistines and cut off a very sensitive part of their body and bring it back to me. And he thought surely David is going to get killed doing this. So David comes back, though. He didn't kill 200 and bring 200 body parts back. 100. He killed 200 Philistines by himself and brought their body parts back and gave them to Saul and says, here, I want my wife. So that's the end of episode 2. Episode 3, things start getting a little dicey. Saul can't send David to death by killing Philistines. So Saul starts, when David's playing his harp, starts throwing spears at David. And things are getting tense, and Saul says, David, I'm just going to kill you. So David flees to his house with his wife, Saul's daughter, and they're holed up in their house, and they're surrounded by Saul's army. And David thinks, I'm not going to get out of this. And there's a really interesting psalm that you can read where he's praying to God when he's being pursued by Saul. And God delivers David from that situation, miraculously delivers David from that situation. Ends episode 3. And then the final episode of season 2 is called Caved In. David, for years, is being pursued by Saul, and he's moving from cave to cave to cave to cave to cave, trying to stay away from this demon-possessed king named Saul who's trying to kill him. We end with a situation looking very bleak in season 2. Year and a half later, thanks Netflix, season 3 begins. And season 3, you may not like this, you may. I called it Make Israel Great Again. Because what happens in the first episode is that Saul goes to war with the Philistines with his son Jonathan, who, remember the Jonathan-David bromance, they're best buds. And Saul and Jonathan, his son, both get killed in battle. So when David hears about that, Saul's dead, so that means he's not in trouble anymore. David comes back into Israel, and at this point, he's assembled an army. They're called his mighty men. So we could even talk about who should be on the cast of the mighty men, like The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, who can sing apparently too. Anyway, so he comes with his mighty men and starts taking city to city to city, and he becomes the king of Israel. And that seems like David is vindicated, right? But then season 3, episode 2, I call it Every Dog Has His Day. If I was David, I'd be like, I want all Saul's family dead, right? Like he was a bad guy. I want to get rid of him. But David asks, is there anyone left from Saul's family? Because I want to show mercy to them. And there's this one man. He was a boy when all this happened, and his name was Mephibosheth, and he was crippled because of having to. Yeah, what a name, right? Thanks, Mom, for naming me Mephibosheth. So he's crippled because when his caretaker was fleeing from the armies that were pursuing him, his caretaker dropped him, and his legs broke and they never worked again. So thanks, Mom, for my name. Thanks, caretaker, for dropping me. This guy's obviously had a terrible life. His family is like the worst named family ever because they're hated. This Saul's family. David says, I want to move you. I want to give you back the land that your family is owed. I want you to have a seat at my table and eat dinner with me every night. He shows him grace. So I called that Every Dog Has His Day. Poor Mephibosheth had the worst luck ever, but David shows him grace. Now the third episode I got to be careful with here in season 3, I called it It's Getting Hot in Her. Because David's a married man. He has some kids at this point. He's sitting on his roof of his palace, and he looks out one night and he sees a lady bathing. And David lusts after her, and he tells his servants, bring her to me, and David sleeps with her. She becomes pregnant. David's like, I made a problem. Oops. So he decides, I'm going to have her husband killed. Even bigger oops. And a man named Nathan, a prophet of God, confronts David and said, David, what you did was sin. And we learn that there are a lot of consequences that happen because of David's mistake. Then the final episode that ends it all, it's called Bad Blood. Once again, a reference to some of my faves. So Bad Blood. David creates a big problem with his infidelity, with acting on his lust, because what happens is now he's got not just sons and daughters, but the sons and daughters now, there's some half-brothers, half-sisters. There's a lot of family dynamics going on, and one of his sons assaults one of his daughters. The son's name was Amnon. The daughter's name was Tamar. Amnon assaults his sister. Amnon's brother, Absalom, Tamar's sister's like, you can't do that to my sister. I'm going to kill you. So he pops a cap, or he cuts his head off, I guess. He has him killed. So now this son Absalom has murdered someone, so David's trying to get justice for this son that was killed. So Absalom flees and gets upset with his dad, David. Absalom comes up with this army and tries to overthrow his own dad and take over the throne. And for a while, David has to flee his palace because his son is pursuing him. Finally, Absalom is killed. David comes back into the palace, and he continues to reign in Israel. He dies an old man. But as you can see, this story would make a great Netflix show. So what I'm asking you to do tonight or tomorrow is answer these questions. Just text me your answers, and I'm going to put all these answers together, and we're going to come up with a pitch for Netflix. So I want you to think about these things as we look back on David's life. That was like a 500-mile-an-hour drive through the life of David, I know. I want you to think about a couple things. The first is that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. As you're reading, and when you get to 1 Samuel chapter 17, you're going to see that Goliath laughed at David when he faced him. He says, "This is what you're sending to me?" Like, the guy still got acne. He's like a teenager. Like, this is going to be easy, and then David kills him. God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. So just because you're a teenager doesn't mean God doesn't want to use you to serve justice for him, to tell others about Jesus, to make a difference in people's life. So David is an example of God using an ordinary person to do extraordinary things. The next thing I want you to notice and learn as you're reading through this tonight or tomorrow is that you can be real with God. If you open to Psalm chapter 3 or Psalm chapter 10, you'll read how David gets... I'm actually just going to read the first verse of Psalm chapter 10 with you. This is David's prayer to God. He says, "Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" Are you allowed to pray that? David did. Yeah. Sometimes it's okay not to be okay, and you can be real with God. I asked a lot of you as you were coming in, "How are you doing?" And you said, "Okay." I almost looked in your eyes and said, "You're a big old liar, because you're not okay. You've been living in a pandemic for 5 months. Prom got canceled. You graduated on a football field. Like you're stuck in a house with your family for 5 months. You're not okay, right? You're not okay." And maybe you don't feel comfortable being real with me, but you can be real with God. And David was real with God. One of David's psalms literally said, "My pillow is wet with my tears, God. What will you do to help me?" So remember that you can be real with God. If you can't be real with anyone else, you can be real with God. Third thing is that sin is a big deal. That sin that David committed was all on him. Did God send the prophet Nathan to confront Bathsheba and say, "Bathsheba, why were you on the top of your house naked?" He didn't ask that to Bathsheba, because that's where all Jewish people would probably bathe, was at the top of their house. It was David's fault. David looked again. David sent someone to bring her to him. David slept with her. David sent somebody to kill her husband to cover it up. It was all on David, and we have to remember the consequences of sin. David's family tree was a hot mess. Some of you know how that is, but David's family tree became a hot mess after that. He had a son assault a daughter. He had a son kill a son. He had this fight that would go on and on and on for control of the kingdom after that, and it had to do with the sin that he committed. But the final thing I want you to know is, as you're looking through this tonight or tomorrow and you're sending your answers in, I want you to remember that everybody needs Jesus. In 1 Kings chapter 2, we read how David died. Even someone as strong and as mighty as David died. No one cheats death. And I believe David is in heaven. We can read verses in the Bible that talk about him as being righteous, that talk about him as having faith. He's in heaven not because he was a great king, not because he killed a giant. He's in heaven because he believed in the one who would come. He believed in Jesus. You can read about that in Psalm chapter 110. He believed that one day the Messiah would come and die for his sins. So David needs Jesus. You need Jesus. Everybody needs Jesus. Yeah, sin is a big deal, but Jesus took that sin on the cross and he died for us. So as you're reading through, it's entertaining, but I also hope you learn these spiritual lessons and realize these spiritual realities as you're reading this. So I hope you hold on to your card. I hope you send these in. This is going to be a lot of fun. Next week we're going to be talking about Samson. That'll be a wild ride too through the life of Samson. But this week it's David. So I'm going to pray for you guys. Then Southside's ready to sling some sliders and tots your way. So I'm going to pray for you guys. Yeah, one of these days we'll be able to put people back in the middle again. You know how we do. But right now this is not a time to put somebody in the middle. That would not be a blessing to them probably. So I'm just going to pray for all you guys. Okay, and then we'll eat and we'll hang out for a little while. Father, thank you that we get to meet, even though it's not maybe ideal conditions, even though it's very different than what we're used to. God, thank you that we have time to spend in your word, and even though this is a different kind of lesson, I pray that you'll, as we read tonight and tomorrow through the life of David, that you'll speak to our hearts, that you'll teach us these spiritual lessons that we learn by considering the life of David. God, I pray that you'll work in our lives, even though these are difficult times and challenging times and confusing times. God, I pray that maybe through this study of David and through Samson and through the others that we're going to study, it'll ground us in your word and remind us who we are in you. In Jesus' name, amen.